All right. Well, I think we're live. This is like a
Sweet.
test run, so I don't know. I told my wife to tune in to see how everything looks. So if anything,
Yeah,
we'll have one
for
audience
sure.
member at some point. But super pumped to be here. Hey, if we never met before, my name's Lance. I'm lead pastor at Communion, and I have the pleasure of hanging out with Martin this morning. Martin, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Martin Cachero, and I'm the pastor at Risen Church. So, two pastors.
Just hanging out, a couple of dudes.
I'm,
Uh,
I'm on also Facebook as we have this conversation, and so I'm watching us live as we
you're.
are having this conversation.
It's kind of like a time machine.
Yep.
So you're our one viewer right now. It's you going live, watching yourself
Yeah.
live.
There you go. I
Oh
just want to
man,
see. Yeah. There we go.
very cool. Well, thanks for joining me, brother. I've been looking forward to this conversation, especially in
Yeah.
this moment. So we are in this coronavirus epidemic, pandemic, and it's hard to talk about this because I know everyone's feeds have just been so full of information about what's happening. But what I think at this point is we want to try and leverage the moment to grow, to develop, to figure out what it looks like to love and follow Jesus at this moment. So for us, I think the first thing I realized or noticed was that um, we got a viewer. Here we go. We'll put him up here.
Nice.
uh, is that all of our rhythms and routines have been completely thrown off. Like everything has been completely changed and drastically. And some of you, even watching, maybe you've lost your job or your hours have been cut or kids are home, you're homeschooling. Like everything has shifted in the moment. And what I've realized is there's probably a lot of normal routine things that I was partaking in when life was normal and ordinary that weren't producing within me a life of love or pursuing Jesus in a holistic way. So I think this interruption or this disruption that's happening in this modern moment is giving us the advantage of examining what normal life was before all this happened, before the coronavirus happened.
Mm,
And I think something super
yeah.
helpful at this point is maybe making some movement towards a disciplined or intentional life as we learn to follow Jesus. So I have a quick quote that I wanted to share, and then I was going to start off and ask you a question, Martin. But
Sure. Yeah.
this quote comes from John Ortberg. So John Ortberg says, "I arrange my life around the practices through which I receive power to do what I can." Through which I receive power to do what I cannot do now by direct effort. So he's making this point that these disciplines or practices that every follower of Jesus should be living into, which we're about to talk about, produce in us a life of power in the Spirit that we can't otherwise do by ourselves. And so in this
Hmm.
moment, as all of our number rhythms have shifted, what a great opportunity for us to step in for a second, just to pause and to reflect and maybe find some new ways of moving forward and creating habits and routines in the life after the coronavirus. So I thought a great place to
Sure.
start with, and a place that you and your church have rested for a few weeks now, is the rule of life. So I wanted to give you some space
Yeah.
to just maybe even just to start describe it. What is the rule of life?
Yeah. Well, can I just back up one step before I answer the what, and maybe the why?
Yeah.
Just because for us this was helpful. Let me read another quote. I think that will contribute to this conversation from Dallas Willard. He was a smart guy, had a lot of smart things to say,
For sure.
um, especially around the realm of spiritual formation.
Yeah.
Well, he says this. He says spiritual formation in the Christian tradition is a process of increasingly being possessed and permeated by the character traits of Jesus as we walk in the easy yoke of discipleship with Jesus, our teacher. And
Amen.
so,
Yeah.
one way to think about the Christian life is, yeah, we're disciples of Jesus, following the way of Jesus. And so I think that quote is helpful because he's reminding us that spiritual formation is just, that's what happens in discipleship. That's this season that we're in. A part of what's happening is formation, because formation is not just a Christian thing, but it's a human thing.
Yep.
To be human is to be dynamic and not static, meaning we're all being shaped and we're all being formed by something or someone. And so, yeah, we're all disciples of something or someone. And I guess one way to look at this era of coronavirus, it's a discipleship opportunity, I guess.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what's going to disciple you in this season? So the question is not, are you being formed? Rather, what is forming you?
Yep.
And so trying to be intentional about how, or intentional about, how we answer that. And so for us, the why goes back to formation. Because whether life pre-COVID, life post-COVID, life in the moment, it's something that we feel like we're called to not just feel, but believe that this is what we're called to pay attention to.
Absolutely.
And so, go ahead.
I was just gonna say the why is so important, and I went way too fast over it. But that why is being pulled out of like that formational piece, which leads to the good life in Jesus, that wholeness that we talk about, that fullness, that peace, all those things we talk about. It reminded me of a piece of a prayer from the Valley of Vision that says, "Help me to know continually that there can be no true happiness, no fulfilling of thy purpose for me apart from a life lived in and for the Son of thy love." So this process of formation is stepping into the way of Jesus and living that formational life.
Yeah.
So, it's so good. So can you describe what the rule of life is for us?
Yeah, so let me start from a kind of 30,000 foot perspective and then kind of narrow in on it. And we've already touched on it. A rule of life has to do with our discipleship and our formation. And it comes out of an understanding and conviction of the gospel. And it has to, because one, a rule of life is singular rule, not rules of life. They're not a list of to-dos and don'ts, right? We're not concerned about, and I think for Christians, we're a little bit allergic. We have an emotional allergic reaction to rules.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about rules. We're talking about a structure, a set of practices and rhythms that orient us back to the gospel.
Yeah.
One illustration that I think is helpful, and actually the word rule has roots in this image, is that the word rule comes from the word trellis. So think of a vineyard. If you've ever gone wine tasting, you go to the vineyard and grapevines are grown in on trellises, and they don't just grow wild on the ground. Part of that reason is wild grapes or wild grapevines, they don't produce fruit to the potential that it would if they grew on trellises. And so that structure is what helps promote growth and orients growth upward and outward for the grapevine, so that it would bear much fruit.
Right.
And so we think of John 15. Jesus is the vine and we are the branches, and being connected to Jesus. So I think even the Bible uses a lot of that illustration, being connected to him. But one of the things that how do we abide in Jesus? And I think that's where that structure, a rule of life, comes in. It's a set of rhythms and practices that orient us back towards the gospel. They remind us who we are. They remind us what we're about. They remind us the way of Jesus. So when we find ourselves in a season, and it could be a really, really long season, a new season that we're in, when the rug is pulled from underneath us, we could be reactionary to our external circumstances, or we can lean into who we already are in Christ and what Christ is doing in and through us. And I think the rule of life helps us get there, points us and holds us up, especially in moments like this.
Absolutely.
So that's so that's what a rule of life is. There's a set of rhythms and practices that continually helps us to pay attention to Jesus in all of life, in the season of lament, in the season of grief, in the seasons of joy, and everything else between. So yeah, that's how I would define a rule of life, and that comes from, I think from not just a biblical understanding, but some resources that are helpful. I know Cachero in his book Emotionally Healthy Spirituality talks about it this way, and there's tons of other resources out there. So this is where I've pulled this definition from.
Yeah, absolutely. That resource from Cachero is so good. If no one's read Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, put that on the book list for sure. And the rule of life, I think, is important too to also realize is it's an ancient practice that's been a part of the church for a really long time. So we think of the Desert Fathers or the kind of the monastical movement with Gregory. I can't ever say his last name. Is it Nazarenus or something? I don't know. But was developed for a long time.
Yeah.
So the rule of life is then, I love the imagery you talk about, this trellis where we get to place our life before this structure in order to grow up and to develop and to flourish and to really flower, if we're to take the metaphor even further. But the rule of life finds different passions or maybe even categories that we put energy into, right? So there's typically four kind of buckets that we talk about. What categories are you using as you build your own rule of life with yourself and in your church?
Yeah, and I think again, because this has to come out of understanding of the gospel, and this is what led to how we defined, I guess, the four buckets of areas of or the dimensions of our rule of life. And so the four dimensions or four buckets of our rule of life is actually an understanding of the fourfold nature of shalom.
Okay.
We can unpack that here a little bit, but the way we understand shalom, it's more than just peace. Shalom is it's the right relationship with God, the way God intended things to be.
Yeah.
It's peace, it's beauty, it's all those things that we see in Genesis 1, and even at the end of the end of the biblical narrative in Revelation. It's just this life with God. The second aspect of shalom would be life with each other, shalom with each other, so living in peace with one another, living in order, living in love. Third would be living in peace within ourselves, this sort of inner shalom. And then that fourth dimension would be the relationship with us and the world. And we define that through vocational calling, our secondary callings in life. And so those are our four buckets, right? The four dimensions of shalom, fourfold nature of shalom. And I know I'm using a lot of kind of Christianese language, so let me just try to ground it here. So for us, there's four dimensions. Number one, it's our relationship with God.
Yeah.
And we define that through prayer. Second, it's our relationship with one another. It's a with-word dimension, a movement towards one another. And so we call that community. Third, it's the relationship within ourselves.
Yeah.
So we define it by rest. It's this inner soul rest. And then fourth, it's relationship to creation or relationship to the world. And we define that through our callings and vocations or work. So it's a more robust understanding of work, not just the work that you get paid to do. So those are our four buckets. So it has an upward dimension, a withward dimension, an inward dimension, and then a outward dimension.
Right on. I want to put these up so people can see them as we talk about them. So with God, with each other, with ourselves, kind of like the inward focus. And then the other thing was with the world.
Yeah. And I can unpack, I don't know if we have the time to unpack all four of these, but I can kind of go in more detail what we mean by some of these things.
Yeah, why don't we kind of add some backbone to each kind of bucket or piece of shalom that we're striving for, and maybe give like one or two practices that you find yourself or your church doing in each space?
Yeah. Um, let's see. I just taught on rest this last Sunday. So our church has been going through the rule of life, and we started this 4 weeks ago before COVID-19. And so it was a little bit timely for us. And we've found it super helpful by God's grace, I think, just working through our church in particular. And so this last Sunday, I talked about rest, so this inner shalom. And I've talked about how rest is something that God has designed for us, right? We see that in the creation story. We rest because God rested, right? We are image bearers. And so rest is a part of God's design for us. And in many ways, COVID-19 is like God forcing us to rest,
Yeah.
not just physically. So when we talk about rest, we're not just talking about physical rest. We're not just talking about sleep. We're talking about the kind of rest that our souls ultimately need. It's resting from not just making things, but it's resting from trying to make something of ourselves, right? It's resting from trying to produce and trying to promote and trying to preserve, right? However we want to define those in our lives, because the COVID-19 can do things. Either you just react to it and life is over and chaos, and you just move towards self-preservation, or right, like, or it's an invitation to really trust God in this and rest that He does hold all things together, even though we don't understand our circumstance, because that's the biblical principle of rest. Resting means that we trust in God and not ourselves. And so one of the practices of rest is simply the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And for us, a Sabbath might be old, right? We're like, okay, yeah, Martin, Sabbath, I get it. I do that. But for some of us, a Sabbath might be new, that we don't practice regular Sabbath. But for every single one of us, I believe that the Sabbath is absolutely necessary. Our I would say worldly understanding of rest is you work, and then in the summer you find some time to rest and you go on vacation with the family or
Yeah.
with your spouse or significant other, whether for for a week or two. But typically that vacation is never quite the rest that we thought it would bring.
You need a rest from the vacation.
And vacation from vacation is the joke, and because and then we go back to work, and we never really rested. But part of it is, I think that's one, our culture is addicted to work, and so we have I think, poor understanding of rest, and Jesus offers us a different way of resting, a different rhythm and different practice, which is, it's an interplay between work and rest, and it's a weekly rhythm, and it's not metaphorical when Jesus says rest. No, you physically stop, and you actually stop doing things. And I think, again, this might be old and like, yeah, Martin, I know that, but for some of us, we don't know this, or we've forgotten this. And I think this is a vital piece to what it means to follow Jesus and what we're doing, to just rest, not to ignore the pains of the world, but as Jesus slept in the boat in the midst of the storm, understanding that God is in control. And so, it's an invitation to rest and admit our limitations, and that God is bigger than all these things. God is bigger than COVID-19, and He knows what He's doing, even though it might not feel like it, even though we're feeling, some of the hardships that this caused. So I don't want to minimize any of that stuff, but I also do think it's an invitation to rest in God. And so one practical way is to just physically rest and to stop. So that's one, I think, practice
Yeah, I think
that
that's
you could
great.
do at this time in one way. Um,
And I think
so
I would probably add or pose, I think most of us know about the Sabbath, but I think most of us have lived into the cultural narrative of just the work life of grinding.
hmm
And so I think
right,
the invitation to rest is actually a scary or fearful place because I have to lay down my striving. I have to lay everything down and trust
yeah,
that God is working on my behalf. And so I love the language of Sabbath and the ways that Jesus invites us to rest, especially even as he
hmm
models it. He goes off into the wilderness, the Eremos, all the time. He leaves his disciples after these
right,
crazy miracle moments. Instead of celebrating, he
right,
goes off into the hills and prays with the Father. And so I think he gives us an example that rest is extremely important, not just for like our inward being, although it's true, but it also helps us trust that God is truly working for us for our
yeah.
own good. But
We have such a we we want to earn everything that we have,
yeah,
and but rest is such a powerful and beautiful picture of the gospel, because when you rest, you do nothing,
hmm,
and yet God still says He loves you.
yeah,
You achieve nothing on the Sabbath, and God still declares His love over you, and that's what the gospel is. And so, um, yeah, and that's, I think, we miss that sometimes.
absolutely. So these four buckets or these four expressions of shalom in people's lives, living in peace with God, with each other, with ourselves, and
hmm
the world. I think it's super important to note that these aren't for professionals or pastors. This is what Jesus is inviting every single follower to as we learn to disciple in Him or apprentice to Him. So I love how I think most of us have a category for living in peace with God and each other. I don't think most people have categories for living in peace with ourselves, finding forgiveness in our identity in Jesus. There's so much of the New
Yeah.
Testament scriptures dealing with our identity in Christ and what that means for us. And most Christians, I think, might have a small window of language for living for the sake of the world or living for the peace of the world. And so, what I think the
Yeah.
Rule of Life does is it brings this really holistic and wide, broad approach to what it means to be a follower of Jesus and gives us a little bit of imagination to grow and to develop into even more deeper and deeper ways with Jesus. So, for you,
hmm
how has the Rule of
Yeah.
Life affected your apprenticeship to Jesus? What are those benefits maybe that you've seen in your own life if you've sacrificed and disciplined? And what are the challenges that you're still facing?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you have certain rhythms and practices that that looked a certain way prior to homeschooling, if you have kids, or officing from home, those sorts of things, and that has changed. And so some of those things have been disrupted in a way where, like, okay, some of the way that I rested in the past might not look the same in the season now. But the principle of rest is not does it go away. It's actually finding, and I get it. Like, this is new for us, and so we're in flux. We're trying to figure out some of those rhythms right now, and trying to figure out what the new schedule looks like, at least for another month in our context. But it's paying attention to, yeah, I think just paying attention to what you are doing regularly. I think it's really as simple as that, because I think sometimes when we think of this, we think of the Sabbath, we think of, however else we want to play out the rule of life. You don't necessarily have to start something new. I think you just look at the way you're already living your life, and it's just making some of those. One is having a paradigm change, and then seeing the things that you're already involved in and how those opportunities could be places of rest. Like, one example, I'm a plant guy. I love plants. If you come to my house, I have plants all over the place.
All right.
Plants can feel like a chore.
Yeah.
At one point, they did. If you've ever tried to keep plants alive, it's a lot of work, and it's
That's why I don't garden.
just because, yeah. But then it became an opportunity for me to spend time with God, and I know that sounds
Mm,
super cliche, and but it really has, because it
That's sweet.
became I love plants because the imagery it gives us. I mean, the Bible uses the idea of life and agricultural kind of illustrations and pictures all over the Bible, because I think it's such a depiction of life and growth and formation and all that stuff. But it's become like a neat little time of prayer for my own life, because when I'm watering the plants, it's like it's in front of me, reminding me, like the plant, how God provides everything that that I need, my growth, my transformation, my all those things. And so it's finding those things in your life already that you're doing, and those could be opportunities of rest, or they could be, or they could do the exact opposite. So I think in one sense, when you start to build out a rule of life, or start to build out these new rhythms and practices, it's taking what's the word? Just you're paying attention to just your schedule and your rhythm already, and what you're doing, and just being thoughtful about how that time could be used. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Trying to figure out how to
So,
pivot those normal everyday things to be present with God's Spirit in the moment. So it's an ordinary work, but it's also helping to
mhm.
shape your perspective of how God is involved with normal life. Because He's there when you're changing diapers, when you're cooking dinner, when you're planting your plants, when you're reading His Word. He's present with you at every moment. So yeah, it's a good
Right.
word. It's some good wisdom for sure.
So yeah, Kathleen Norris wrote this little book called The Quotidian Mysteries, and she speaks directly to that. The mundane parts of life, we often gloss over those things, but those are the things that actually mold us and shape us more than like the big events of life. Although those
Right.
are, they shape us as well. But it's the routine things like changing diapers, or washing dishes, or even um, washing your face and making the bed. Another really great book that talks about this is Liturgy of the Ordinary, by Tish Warren Harrison, and she talks about how some of these things that we do, from making the bed to making coffee in the morning, are opportunities to experience and wake up to the presence of God in that moment, because
Yeah.
God is God of all, so He is working in all things, not just the big things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think for anyone who's listening, we're not saying to do more, we're saying to do less and to be more aware of what's
yeah,
going on in your life, to examine the normal habits and practices. Are those things helping you progress in the way of Jesus? Are they helping you grow? Are they helping you experience God's presence? Because if they're not, maybe this is a time to pivot, to maneuver, to change those normal rhythms, to be more aware of how God's moving in your life. So we've got a couple of
right.
resources. I'm going to post a little resource on Communion's page. I wanted to pull up our uh, URLs again. Martin's been teaching through these buckets of the real life, or what it means to live into shalom. And so his teachings are connected to his SoundCloud on the website. So go check out his teachings. I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to post a little worksheet for anyone who's interested of the 4 different areas of shalom, and you can go in and fill out what are some practices or habits, what are some routines or behaviors that you can do to start living in peace with God or each other or with yourself and the world, as a way to maybe put some of the stuff on paper and begin to build out a framework or a trellis for you to live intentionally in this COVID era and post-COVID, when things do settle down at some point. But Martin, thank you so much for joining me,
Mm-hmm.
man. It's great to be in a conversation with you, and I think it was really helpful to hear you kind of explain this rule of life for us. So appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for asking the questions. I think this is, hopefully, my prayer is that this would be helpful to others. So, thank you.
Amen. Absolutely.